hello, everyone. I am Cindy Grossman. I am a relatively new addition to the FDA as the Division Director for the Division of Patient-Centered Development in the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. So I am a social and behavioral scientist by training. I've worn a bunch of different hats over my career. Work in academia, then in government at NIH, in nonprofit health policy at the Milken Institute, and most recently, I come from industry where I led a real-world research network in multiple sclerosis. So the point of my intro really is that no matter where I've worked, the through line has always been to use my expertise both on the scientific side as well as on the coalition building and collaboration and direct patient engagement side to lead efforts to bring the lived experience of patients, caregivers, and communities into product development and implementation. And I am so excited to join this webinar, not only to share the work of our division and CDRH, but also to be able to have a discussion with these experts that we have joining us to better understand some of the drivers and challenges that the medtech industry has when it comes to understanding patients' unmet needs and to developing safe and effective products that meet those needs. So yeah, excited to be able to talk with you today. Let me first start by, before we advance the slides, by handing it over to my co-presenter, Femi Babalola. Femi, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Cindy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Olufemi Babalola. I go by Femi. By background of my training, I trained as a health economist, but I ultimately ended up focusing on stated preference methodology, which is the methods we use to sort of measure patient preferences and stakeholder preferences of interest. I've been at the FDA, specifically the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, since 2016. I've sort of played several roles there while at the center. My work sort of mostly centers around providing consultative reviews on patient preference methodology, conducting research on patient preference methodology, and also sort of just educating internal and external stakeholders on these methods. I look forward to speaking to you today and also learning from you, and welcome the interaction with the audience. I'll hand it over to Christine Paulus. Christine?
Thank you. I'm Christine Polis, and I lead the Health Preference Assessment Group at RTI Health Solutions. RTI is a nonprofit research organization, and we support medical device and pharmaceutical manufacturers by doing research in a variety of practice areas, and one of them happens to be preference research. So I have over 25 years of quantitative preference research experience. I've worked in a variety of different settings, including government, academics, but I've been at RTI now for 20 years. And the last 15 years, I've focused on applications of preference to health. So RTI Health Solutions partnered with FDA to conduct the agency's first preference study on treatments for obesity. And we've partnered with the agency on several studies since then in other therapeutic areas, including diagnostics and osteoarthritis. And I also worked on the first preference study submitted to CDRH and presented to an advisory panel to support benefit risk assessment for a pre-market approval. So that was some time ago. It was in 2018. But since then, I and other members of the health preference assessment team at Health Solutions have worked with other medical device manufacturers and other companies to engage with the agency about preference and to conduct preference studies to support both internal and regulatory decision-making at different points in the product development lifecycle. So we've learned a lot of lessons alongside our partners in industry and FDA, and we hope to share them in today's webinar.
I can jump in, Christine. Good afternoon, I'm Todd Snell. I am a regulatory affairs advisor and leadership coach at Camber Advisors. Spent most of my career in medical technology as well as biopharmaceuticals, assuming different roles of leadership in cross-quality assurance, regulatory affairs and compliance, as well as clinical affairs. I've had the opportunity to work across multiple disease states and technologies. And really culminating my executive career at Next Stage Medical, then Fresenius Medical Care. I'm excited to speak today about how we've used patient preference in our past to do an expansion of an indication using patient preference and benefit risk. So very happy to be here.
Great. So I also do want to mention that we do have one of my colleagues, David Gevin, on the phone as well on the webinar. So when we get into discussion, you've got the full suite of our expertise in patient preference information at CDRH on hand. So that's exciting to have him join us as well. So I just want to give a little bit of kind of background to set the stage for folks who might be joining this webinar who are new to patient preference information. You might be new to patient preference information, but it has been part of our overall approach for integrating patient experience and perspectives in the development of medical devices at CDRH for a while, and has been part of our methodology related to benefit risk for quite some time. So next slide, please. So we do focus here on making sure that we both handle both the patient engagement, direct patient engagement side, as well as the patient experience data. Next slide, please. And patients are really at the heart of what we do here at CDRH. And this reflects both that focus on that direct engagement and as well as the scientific rigor that we need to have in order to utilize that information in our decision making. Next slide, please. So, CDRH believes, and we've also seen evidence of this and have case examples of the following benefits of hearing directly from the patient. And that includes things related to, device clinical trial design and clinical trials. It relates to how to kind of integrate patients' perspective into our thinking and current and evolving technologies. It also relates to areas where we can confirm or raise problems that might exist within specific devices. Of course, we're interested in understanding and communicating the treatment preferences on the part of patients, and then identifying specific patient populations where a benefit risk for any given treatment might be really important to understand. And I'll talk a little bit about that idea later on. Next slide, please. So we're really focused here on the total product life cycle. And this slide just really highlights that throughout the total product life cycle, there are many opportunities to engage patients and to understand their perspectives, whether that's early on in the device design, all the way through to product launch and post-market monitoring activities. Next slide, please. But I do want to kind of level set for the purposes of this webinar some terminology, because patient preferences is one sort of aspect of what we're going to talk about today, but I want to make sure I put it in the totality of context of what CDRH is focused on in our patient science portfolio. And the first is just to say that, we have patient experience data, and that's obviously the data on the impact of the disease or condition or related therapy on patients' lives. We have patient engagement, and that's really the direct interaction with patients that facilitates that kind of mutual learning and effective collaboration across that total product life cycle that I showed. And then finally, we have the science of patient input. And that, if you think about that, that's kind of the umbrella under which or over which all those different types of methodologies that I'm going to talk about today kind of fit and provide us with the framework to have this evidence and this information be valid and scientifically rigorous enough to use in our regulatory decision making. So next slide, please. So there's really three areas of focus in terms of our science of patient input portfolio. And we're going to talk mostly about patient preferences today, and you'll hear a bit more about that definition and the details there from Femi. But I do want to call out that we have patient-reported outcomes, and some of you may be quite familiar with those in terms of those being directly measured from patients' outcomes in terms of the outcomes that are coming directly from them without any interpretation of anyone else. And then we also have our patient engagement, which again is that intentional, meaningful interaction with patients. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows, really is just to give you just the overview of the history of patient preference at CDRH, and to note again that while folks are kind of coming at this information perhaps new, it's been something that CDRH has been working on for some time. And that really started with kind of thinking about the benefit risk guidance that we had, as well as thinking about how to launch initiatives that put the patients at the center of that benefit risk guidance. And so working on patient-centered benefit risk, and then building some case examples, and you'll hear about some of them today in terms of what the other panelists are going to share. And you'll also hear about how we have a recently released updated draft guidance on patient preference information as well. So we continue to work in this area, even though we've been working in it for a while. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. All of this work has seen some traction. And so this just really highlights that in terms of the submissions that we see at CDRH, a proportion of them are including patient-reported outcomes, and we are seeing patient preference information be submitted to FDA for consideration. And so, this work is starting to gain traction, and we've seen some areas of interest. And again, you're going to hear about more today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Femi, who's going to be the subject matter expert. He has a challenging task to provide you with a broad but comprehensive picture of patient preference information in just a few slides, and talk about the current thinking of CDRH and its applicability in our thinking and some key considerations. So Femi, take it away.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Next slide, please. As Cindy earlier sort of noted, at FDA at CDRH, we really value the patient voice in all that we do. Patient preference information, I'll call it PPI, provides a systematic approach to integrating the patient voice into our decision-making. Our definition of PPI is the quantitative and qualitative assessments of the relative desirability or acceptability to patients of specified alternatives or choices among outcomes or other attributes that differ among alternative health interventions. While it's preferable to hear from patients directly, there are also other situations where hearing from caregivers or care partners may also be appropriate. For example, in cases where young children or patients present with advanced dementia. Next slide, please. This graphic speaks to the potential uses of PPI across the TPLC. Across the TPLC, we have the development phase, the clinical trial design phase, benefit risk assessment phase, and the post-market phase. PPI can be helpful across many decision points in this phase. For example, PPI can be used to inform target treatment profiles. For example, what features device developers can use in their devices. PPI can also support decision points that involve informing performance targets for clinical trials or outcome or endpoint selection. PPI is also helpful in the pre-market benefit risk phase by showing the benefit risk balance from the patient perspective. PPI is also useful in the post-market phase for things like labeling expansion. Next slide, please. We have a PPI guidance document that provides detailed information on PPI, what it is, and how it can be used in regulatory submission. Our first and current PPI guidance was issued in 2016, and we recently reissued a draft guidance that will be replacing our 2016 guidance. Next slide, please. The core elements of our draft guidance is consistent with the current 2016 guidance. For example, PPI data doesn't change evidentiary standards in our reviews. However, PPI, which is voluntary information, and our guidance provides recommendations for collecting PPI data that can result in valid scientific evidence to submit to support regulatory decision-making. Ultimately, we care about the totality of evidence. The FDA may consider PPI alongside other clinical and non-clinical data in decision-making. Next slide, please. Our guidance provides details on what we consider recommended qualities of PPI study. In summary, a PPI study that could result in valid scientific evidence needs to be all about patients, adopt good study design, including effective benefit risk communication, establish good research practices, and robust study conduct and analysis. Next slide, please. However, there are a few updates in our PPI draft guidance. For example, our title was updated to better reflect the fact that PPI is useful across the total product lifecycle. We also provided numerous case examples to show that PPI, in addition to the only one example, which was the obesity study in our 2016 guidance, that demonstrates the use of PPI earlier in the total product lifecycle and in the post-market phase. We also provided our draft guidance that evidence that PPI should adopt rigorous quantitative and qualitative methods in study design approaches. We provided an additional appendix listing possible methods that could be applicable. This list is not exhaustive. In addition, in our draft guidance, we also describe the concept of fit-for-purpose PPI studies. This constitutes PPI studies that have a research question that is patient-centric and also lists other ideas around study objectives and study parameters. In our draft guidance, we also fleshed out the fact that PPI is also applicable early in the total product lifecycle and later on the post-market phase, in addition to pre-market benefit risk. A note about our draft guidance. Please note that we are accepting comments on our draft guidance, and the terminal date for accepting comments is December the 5th, 2024. There's a link here that provides that shows where you can submit comments on our draft guidance. We welcome your feedback. Next slide, please. Final considerations. To recap, PPI provides a systematic and scientific approach to integrating the patient voice into our work at CDRH. Although PPI submission is voluntary to the FDA, PPI may provide additional context to data that is submitted for benefit risk determination and all the determinations at the center. PPI may also be helpful in earlier phases of device development, in addition to post-market and pre-market phase. In summary, we encourage early interactions with the FDA review staff if planning to initiate or design a PPI study or to submit PPI. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Cindy and Femi both, and thank you for joining us. It's really a tremendous opportunity to have you, as people designing and running this program, connect here with industry and share these insights with our audience. Christine, you're up.
Okay, great. So in the next few minutes, we'll be presenting a series of case studies. The first one that I'll be presenting is an example of the use of preference information in an early phase of the development lifecycle. This case involved a device or a system to deliver tympanostomy tubes or ear tubes to children. So these are the tubes that are used to treat children who are experiencing chronic ear infections that might not have responded to antibiotic treatments or watchful waiting. The next slide, please. So traditionally, ear tubes are successfully inserted in children under general anesthesia in an operating room. Tusker Medical, in this case, developed the tubeless ear tube delivery system, which was a first of its kind device, and it allowed for the insertion of ear tubes in a doctor's office under local anesthesia rather than under general anesthesia in an operating room. So there were a number of potential benefits they recognized throughout the product development, The children would avoid being exposed to general anesthesia. There was no parent or child separation during the procedure, no fasting to prepare for a procedure. However, the Tula system was likely to have a lower success rate than the traditional approach. So Tusker and FDA agreed to a single arm study for the pivotal trial for this device system. And the performance goal was to be the goal of technical success. But rather than have either Tusker or FDA choose the success rate, Tusker Medical partnered with RTI to do a study to understand what success rate would be acceptable to parents considering the use of ear tubes in children. And so this was a study that was conducted by some of my colleagues here at Health Solutions. Next slide, please. So as Femi alluded to, there are several methods used in preference assessment, and the draft guidelines that he mentioned list some of those in one of the appendices and include extensive references related to method selection and implementation. This study used a threshold technique. First, the study explained both the in-office procedure and the operation room-based procedure options and described in detail the characteristics of those options and the outcomes, which we refer to as attributes. So you'll hear that throughout the next few minutes as we discuss these case studies. So we described the attributes associated with each of these procedures, both in office and operation room based. And in this study, the threshold technique was selected to assess the minimum acceptable success rate that parents would accept to have an in-office procedure instead of a procedure completed in an operating room. So this picture on the slide here is an example of what a preference question looked like in this study. Parents could choose between the operation room-based procedure with a fixed success rate of more than 99% or the in-office procedure with a lower success rate. And then through a series of questions that looked like this and were systematically varied based on the respondents' choices, the results indicated that parents would prefer the Tula in-office procedure as long as its success rate was at least 68%. So as a result of this study and the discussions between Tusker Medical and FDA, the performance goal for the Tula pivotal clinical trial was set using these results. And ultimately, next slide, the system, the PMA was approved in 2019. So it was successful. And now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa, who's hopefully well connected to start off the next case study. Okay, and this next case study will be discussing how preference information can be used to support benefit risk assessment. So this is an example of an application later in the product life cycle.
Thanks, Christy. My name is Vanessa DeBrune. I'm a Senior Clinical Research Director at Medtronic. And we felt it was important to collect patient preference information to understand patients' perspectives on an interventional procedure that's used to treat high blood pressure. We're exploring renal denervation as one option to manage high blood pressure out of several options that are already available, including lifestyle modifications, antihypertensive medications, and in some instances, just choosing no action. So patient preference for us was really intended to insert the voice of the patient into the overall benefit risk assessment for potential pre-market approval of our product. This also considers the patient as part of a shared decision-making, that they're really taking part in their healthcare. So when we embarked on collecting patient preference information, we realized we really didn't have the expertise in-house. So therefore, it was important for us to seek out an expert in the patient preference research field, such as RTI.
So RTI worked really closely with Medtronic on this study, and we started off trying to understand the treatment options available so that we could design a study that was fit for purpose. So Vanessa describes the different treatment options in the landscape at the time. And what we could see is there were several attributes or treatment features that were distinct across these different options. So there's different modes of administration, there's different risks of mode-related adverse events, and they had different levels of efficacy. So for this study, we chose a discrete choice experiment as the preference method to use. This is different than the method that I discussed previously with the ear tube case study. A discrete choice experiment was selected because it's a method that quantifies preferences and trade-offs for multiple attributes simultaneously. And that was important in this case where there were multiple differences across the treatments. We did an online survey with 400 adults, and they all had physician-confirmed uncontrolled hypertension. And we strive to ensure that we used good research practices and were conducting a study that was patient-centered, clinically relevant, in order to get the best quality of data possible so that it could be considered evidence to support the FDA's benefit risk assessment. In addition to using the scientific literature and preference, we also made use of the FDA's PPI guidelines, in which they list a number of qualities that they're looking for in patient preference studies that are submitted to the agency to support their decision-making. We consulted with the FDA at several points during the survey development and the study execution in order to present a protocol and the study materials. And the FDA provided comments throughout the project that helped us fine-tune the survey instrument, the overall study design, and the data analysis. So this slide lists some of the activities that we did to ensure that the survey development and the data collection were as rigorous as possible. For a preference study, it's really important that the information presented in the survey and the data that we generate is aligned with the clinical data that's being collected in the trial. In order to do that, we relied on the Medtronic experts on the study team to support us with up-to-date clinical literature and also findings as they became available from the clinical trials to ensure that we had that relevance and that clinical relevance in the study design. We also ensured that the survey instrument was patient-centered by doing pre-test interviews. We did these with patients who would meet the eligibility criteria for the survey itself. The objective of these pre-tests is to ensure we're getting the patient perspective on these treatments for hypertension, to understand how they view the information being presented, if they can understand it, and make sure that the survey is just working as intended. On the basis of the pre-test interview findings, we made revisions to the survey to improve it based on what we heard. And for this study, because it was conducted during the COVID pandemic, we did a second round of pre-tests to explore how patients would answer these preference questions and survey questions in light of the pandemic-related healthcare changes. We consulted with the FDA after the pre-test, shared with them the findings from the pre-test and how they informed revisions to the survey and the study. When we conducted the study, we ensured that we had a sample that was reflective of the US population with hypertension. And we did this by partnering with a qualified patient recruitment partner and establishing target sample sizes to ensure we had diversity in terms of geographic location, race and ethnicity, and some other patient characteristics. And finally, we conducted the data analysis using good practices and conducted sensitivity analyses with the results to ensure that they were consistent across a variety of different assumptions, and to explore how the results would vary depending on different clinical outcomes.
Patient choices in the survey revealed that blood pressure reduction was more important than any other attribute, including procedural risk. Once we took that data and we applied it to model preferences to the safety and efficacy outcomes in our pivotal studies, it is estimated that up to 30% of patients would select an interventional treatment, such as renal denervation, if presented with an option. So the resulting patient preference information from this trial or from this study was submitted as part of the PMA package to FDA. And FDA looks at the totality of evidence, which ultimately supported approval of the Simplicity RDN procedure with the spiral catheter.
And the next case will be presented by Todd Snell.
Good afternoon. As Randy mentioned, I'm Todd Snell and want to share a few slides on our experience with patient preference. Patient preference started for us with, and it gives some context, we were representing a home hemodialysis system at the time that had over 19 million HHD home hemodialysis treatments. This device was characterized by very simple, portable, flexible, very safety focused and conscious. And what it provided patients was the ability to dialyze when they wanted to, and also on a more frequent level that gave us a significant amount of clinical evidence that said this was a better way than going to the traditional standard of care, which was going into a dialysis clinic 3 times a week, which limits flexibility, it limits schedule and ability for patients to do what they want and their quality of life. And then secondly, it also, the in-center treatment in a dialysis clinic tends to not mimic the kidney's true actions and functions as much as frequent home hemodialysis, where there's a consistent cleaning of toxins and replacement of fresh electrolytes. So overall, clinically, great system and great applicability for a patient. One of the challenges of our indication was, even at the state of the art of the device, we realized we couldn't mitigate every risk from a design perspective. And those risks were, if a patient's treating at home and they have a sudden cardiac event or a really catastrophic situation, there's no one there to quickly observe and stop treatment and seek help if needed. Additionally, because this is a hemodialysis device, there's a flow of blood going through the patient's body. If there's a needle dislodgement, it could result in a quick, very quick bleed out situation where the patient would not survive. So years ago, when the system was cleared by the FDA, this indication in bold yellow below was put there to help mitigate the risk of what happens if something happens to a patient at home while they're treating. So we agree with the FDA at the time to add a trained and qualified person to be part of these treatments. And if you think about it, that's a tall order, because that observer needs to be near the patient or around the patient or watching the patient at least 5 to 6 times a week for potentially 3 to 5 hours in duration at a time. And we had heard quite a bit about it's hard to find a good partner. It's hard to put that pressure on a family member or a friend. So we wanted to pursue this path of solo home hemodialysis, which means patients performing a life-sustaining therapy in the home with a complex device. And because we felt there were clinical and quality of life benefits, and this was important. We also felt the therapy wasn't penetrating the market as much. And as we started to speak with patients, we realized the ability to identify a partner, or if they lose a partner, really became a high bar. Third bullet, other therapies or modalities out there, peritoneal dialysis, insulin-dependent diabetes, did not require patients or did not require observers for patients. And so we felt that this was a pretty high bar, but how do we get past it with the state of the art of the technology? And so what happened is we had the FDA, the renal team at the FDA scheduled a patient workshop. And we had a number of patient groups coming in and saying, you're limiting us in being able to do solo home hemodialysis. We are willing to take the risk. And so that was really the genesis of us falling down a path of patient preference. And we started out with a direct preference assessment to see, is this even something we want to pursue? Are patients willing to take this risk? And the direct preference assessment told us that 65% of patients would do this even with all the risks. We then moved to a discrete choice model and partnered with the FDA renal team to really have a robust discrete choice model that allowed us to identify those risk thresholds that patients would be willing to accept or not. And so going into the survey, little is known about solo HHD. We didn't even know what the current use was. So the survey helped us do that. Is first, are you doing this? Have you practiced this before? And then the questions we were trying to answer was, would home hemodialysis patients perform solo HHD after considering the benefits and risks of the treatment versus going into an in-center situation and treating 3 days a week? We also, as I mentioned, wanted to identify those risk tolerance thresholds. And these are really important. This is where the discrete choice model allowed us to identify thresholds that to this day we continuously monitor to make sure the experience in the post-market world is not going outside what we set as those initial thresholds. And that allowed us to really understand what the patient would accept for risk, and allowed us to set those, those thresholds on an ongoing basis going forward. And overall, there was excellent work with the patient groups really telling us what they wanted. But then secondly, and most importantly, the partnership with the FDA renal team was absolutely critical. And what I would recommend is partner early, start with a question around risk that you're trying to answer. And then another big key lesson for us was the piloting the survey first to see, do we have the right level of apprehension of the survey and what we're asking for. We had to do that twice over to make sure patients understood what we're asking. Thank you, and pass it back to you, Randy.
Okay, so let's start with some general ones. So when should you use PPI? When is it useful and relevant? You know, what's a grand slam for PPI?
So I'll take the first stab at that, Randy. You know, we've given a lot of thought to that question at CVRH, and remember that PPI is only one tool, right? There's other methodologies that you can use. So it's really, when does that sort of fit in? You know, one of the ways that we thought about it, and we have identified a while back some sort of what we called kind of patient preference sensitive sort of areas. So one of the things would be, you know, if you're thinking about PPI, which is really a benefit risk trade-off, as Christine really highlighted, you're thinking about the benefits and the risks. So something that is of low benefit and low risk would sort of not be necessarily a great spot, but where would be a particularly good spot? And that might be a place where there's a lot of high benefit, but also potential high risk. And some of those areas also that we've seen, you know, might be for patients who certainly have life-threatening conditions, or patients where their experience of their condition might be of advanced progression. You know, I mentioned that I used to work in multiple sclerosis, and there's definitely different rates of progression, for example, within that condition. So I think there's some areas where you think about where there's a high potential for patient benefit, but there's also some significant risks. And for different subsets of patients, they may weigh those benefit risks differently, depending on either their disease state or the sort of subset of the disease that they have. And so really understanding that at a deep level is important, and hearing directly from them. And that's where patient preference methodology can really pull that out. And I think, you know, if at some point we can get Todd's audio working again, I think he can also highlight that the case study that he was talking about really did also highlight a certain subset of patients where solo hemodialysis was particularly appropriate. So finding that niche subset is important. I wonder if either Femi or Christine want to also add to that.
Well said, Cindy. I just wanted to add that our guidance sort of speaks to certain device or classes of devices that present with certain characteristics that lend itself well to patient preference, or what we call preference sensitive areas. And some examples are devices that have a direct patient interface, devices that are developed to fill an unmet need or rare diseases, devices that yield significant health benefits or appearance benefits, sorry. Oh, okay. Welcome back, Todd. Devices that adopt novel technology. Those are some examples of areas where that patient perspective via PPI would be very helpful or useful. Back to you, Randy.
Let me ask this. If somebody's listening to this saying, oh, gee, it's not as safe, but the patient says it's good and the customer is always right. Does this replace clinical evidence? How far does this go?
I can take a stab at that. Again, I'll quote guidance. It's our current thinking. It's our roadmap for how we think about this area of evidence. And PPI does not bypass evidentiary standards, doesn't replace bad clinical data. It complements data, it supplements data, but it's a very important piece to sort of like explain what we are saying. The patient voice is powerful, and we think they're experts in that condition, so we definitely want to hear from them. Now, having said that, PPI could play different roles depending on the context, and it's different on a case-by-case basis. We sort of look at this as the overall body of evidence. So Todd, for example's case example, showed a scenario where PPI played a powerful role in the post-market space. But yes, to sort of go back to your question, we don't think it's a way to bypass safety and effectiveness. We just think it's a way to complement whatever data you have available. Yeah.
Last, I think to build on Femi's point, we had a device that was a life-sustaining device in the home, and it had some indication limitations. And patients had said to us, these limitations are too much, and it's preventing us from able to use this therapy that has clinically better outcomes. We felt uncomfortable because as a device manufacturer, we were at that state of the art in the design, and we really couldn't go any further. So it became a risk discussion around, okay, if we update this indication, in this case, our patients needed to treat with an observer 5-6 times a week, 4 to 5 hours at a duration each treatment. And the patient said to us, we can't maintain a partner. We want to do this ourselves. And so it became a discussion of, compared to the current state of dialysis in dialysis clinics, what the rate was for cardiac events and mortality, how much would patients prefer to be able to treat on their own, knowing that there are risks there, as opposed to and having that benefit, as opposed to going back into a dialysis clinic to treat since they didn't have a partner. And overwhelmingly, we found patients were willing to take that risk. And what was really interesting with the renal team at the FDA was, we realized through discrete choice studies, we could set thresholds of risk acceptance. And to this day, we still monitor our post-market space to say, have we gone outside with those original thresholds that were set based on the patient's preference, and where there was a comfort level between us and the renal team at FDA.
So you actually really got something through that wouldn't have gotten through otherwise.
Yes.
Try this again.
I think if Todd, if you mute yourself while other people are talking, it'll help.
All right, we'll try this again. So, sorry. Thank you. Good call. There's a weird feedback loop here. Todd, so you really, this was from a business point of view, pretty significant, because you got something pretty major approved for your device that just didn't have a path before. Is that correct?
That is correct, and still not a path. There wouldn't be a path today from a state-of-the-art perspective. We still think we're at that level where it'd be very difficult to mitigate every risk in a home environment with a patient. So I think this really worked out for us as well as an organization, but really it worked out for the patient, that we've seen much more adoption of the technology, and with the physician, we're able to really help the physicians decide who are the right patients for this therapy and really explain risk and benefit before they decide to take treatment without a partner.
That's great. So let me ask a different question to the group. I think for those of us in medtech, the first time I heard about PPI, it kind of, blew my mind a little bit, just that there was this huge regulatory carrot out there that could be put at the disposal of med device manufacturers. Say, if you bring us good scientific grade data about what patients want and how they look at risk and benefit trade-offs, we would not only will we accept it, we would love to accept that. We really are encouraging this. In the commercial world, if you're working at Apple, it's not quite as revolutionary to say, what does the consumer want? What does the patient want? And people who work at places like Apple are really good at designing things like physical devices. They may not be hemodialysis, but all kinds of other devices in our lives. I mean, I think we all have certain things we use in our lives. You're like, wow, this is just a really well-developed thing. Can I just go hire one of those people to do this?
I'll take
Well,
a
I can
stab at
tell-
it and then
Oh,
go ahead, Christine.
I was, I'd like to hear what Femi has to say, but I think when it comes to doing a preference study, there are similarities to some of the research you'll see in other settings, but because we're focused on health and there are a number of guidelines and good research practices, it's important when using this information to support regulatory decision making, or even for publication, that the studies be conducted in a way that meets the standards that are set out by those guidelines, and also just the scientific literature. So what that means in a nutshell is that there's really extensive survey development to ensure that the survey itself is patient-centered, that the information provided is understandable to patients. Of course, we want it to be clinically relevant. The survey design itself should be relatively short. The questions should be clear. These surveys often involve the description of health technologies that might not be familiar to patients, and that might be presenting even familiar outcomes in ways that are less familiar, like probabilistic outcomes. So we follow good practices, best practices in terms of risk communication, and we test this extensively with patients. So these are not just opinion surveys that are hastily assembled and administered. They're really built up and layered over time through pre-testing with patients. And then there are some best practices in terms of analysis. Femi, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I agree with everything Christine said. I'll just add that for us at the FDA, these studies need to be well done. They need to meet a particular regulatory standard for us to sort of consider this as valid scientific evidence. These are surveys that need people that have the expertise, the right expertise to do. So I do not think, like Christy said, the average person can do this, Randy. But yes, there's a particular skill set required to do the surveys for them to be considered regulatory standard. That's.
And to build on Femi's point, we started the process, thought we knew how to do surveys and how to gauge customer feedback as an independent device manufacturer. We brought in outside help. Even then, when we did our first pilot survey in this patient preference study, we failed what was our validation criteria of knowledge and understanding of a survey, and realized through the help from the renal team at the FDA at the time that we had to really simplify our terminology. We had to really simplify that discrete choice survey so that patients could understand what they were signing up for. So I would highly recommend, as simple as you can get it, and someone that knows how to do these types of surveys, and bring it to someone that may have a statistics background.
And if I may just jump on that point too, which is, Todd raises an important point, which is, do you know your device to its certain level of precision, right? So I do think that there is some element of making sure that not only do you engage, like Christine and Femi said, the right expertise to help with the patient preference survey methodology and the methodology that you're deploying, but also in your company, do you really understand your device? Do you understand what the benefits are? Do you understand what the risks are? Do you understand what the components are? And then trying to distill that language down into something that people can understand. And that level of precision is pretty important.
And one thing to build on that too is, do you know what your state of the art is? And when we're putting benefit risk in front of patients, are we doing our best in state of the art? And if we are, and it's a reasonable state of the art, that's something we can commercialize and make safe and viable. If we have to go beyond that, and we know that, that's where the patient preference came in really well for us. We had years of clinical data, we had years of the device on the market. we knew what our technological state of the art was, and we knew how far we could go with it.
So first of all, we're at the hour, so I want to thank everybody who's joined us, but we've still got plenty left to cover, so feel free to hang around. We'll try and answer questions. Let's go on the assumption that most people are on this call because they aren't familiar with PPI and that you're at a manufacturer and you're like, ooh, this all sounds good, but it seems a little overwhelming. How do I get started? So kind of what are first steps? Who's the team at your organization? Who approves it, who designs it, how early and often do you go talk to the FDA, and how do you do that? Let's just talk about kicking one of these off. What would your first month look like? Recommendations from the parent.
I'd actually like to hear what someone else thinks about this since they are customers. Christine, Todd, do you want to speak to that?
I'm happy to speak to how to get started. I can't speak to how the teams within. What I can say about what I can see working with sponsors is that the teams that come to us are frequently cross-functional teams. They bring together the team that's really involved in the clinical. We also frequently have a regulatory person on the team, and also commercial. So it's a cross-functional team within the sponsor. And when we get started on a study like this, we will really, the very first thing that we do is work really closely with the sponsor to make sure that we understand that device, like Cindy and Todd were just saying. What is the state of the art? What is the clinical data that's available or that is being collected as part of the trial? How can we characterize the alternative treatments as well? And with an understanding of that clinical landscape and the indication, we start to build up the methods that we'll use to make sure that we are selecting a method and designing that method so that it's fit for purpose as the guidelines describe. So using the right method, asking the questions in a meaningful way to ensure that the results we get at the end of the day can be combined with those clinical results and used to support decision-making.
I agree with that. But just sort of speak for on the FDA side of things, to Christine's point, we want the sponsor and their partners to think carefully about what they intend for the PPI to do. So what is their research question? After they figure that out, we highly encourage early interactions with the FDA review staff. That will probably entail them having like a detailed protocol, sort of laying out their thinking, what Christy spent a good deal of time explaining earlier about the study and what they intend to do. That way we can provide feedback on their thinking and approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and as a sponsor, as a sponsor for patient preference some time ago, we really sat back and said, what is the question we're trying to answer? What is the patient risk in this case? What we knew our therapy enough, and we knew we were at sort of the edge of our indication, and we had that we asked the question, could patients possibly treat without a partner? And so after years of clinical data and post-market experience, we used patient preference to help us move forward, but it was based on a really solid question. It wasn't in lieu of clinical data. It wasn't in lieu of a lot of the safety data we had previously. It was, we had a notice, but we had this question that we needed to answer, and we felt that the patients were the best position to answer it.
So sounds like the sum of it is do what we always do, which is a lot of good, careful thinking and design that's backed by science. There's just a different set of tools that you're going to be learning to do that, and some different tricks and trades. And the team is whoever said it was a multidisciplinary team, which disciplines, what would you recommend?
I think it was me that said it was a cross-functional team within the sponsors, on the sponsors team. In terms of the preference researchers, there are the preference researchers out there are mostly mostly economists, health economists. Many of them, these methods were developed in environmental economics. many of them they might have a psychology background, but these are typically social scientists who are involved in the study design, but there's also quite a bit of statistical training, as Todd mentioned, because these are quantitative data that are analyzed using advanced statistical methods. And several of the methods that are commonly used and referenced in the guidance require experimental methods as well. So these are surveys, but they're presenting experimental stimuli to the respondents through the survey. And that's how we elicit preferences, by presenting them with different treatment options and seeing how they would react in terms of choice or preference. So those are the types of skills on the research team.
It's fascinating that economists who study the environment, I guess it makes sense. There's plenty of trade-offs to be made there. So question from the audience, what's the best way to...
Randy, could I add one point to that as well on the previous question, if you don't mind? We employed a market research firm to help us with the initial pilot survey, who had a very strong background in engaging interest in patients and marketing. They also were very strong statistically. They pushed us to a direct preference model. And what we should have done was started with the FDA team and said, how do we do this? And the discrete choice was the way it was supposed to go. And they, even having an outside firm helping us cross-functionally in a mid-sized med device company, we didn't completely have the skills until we partnered with FDA and really landed on discrete choice. We were able to be very clear what we needed from an outside firm for support.
So someone asked, what's the best way to approach the FDA? So let's use that as a case study. You know, you've got this thing, you go through a Q sub. What would you bring as your questions, and what would you have brought as questions in that first meeting? Make the most of it. And then what about the second or third meeting?
I mean, I think on my end, when we approached the FDA, we were both in the same spot. We were hearing it from patient groups that this indication was limiting treatment. And I think we all had, back to that, what is the question we're trying to answer based on already significant clinical data? It wasn't, hey, FDA, how do we use a patient preference assessment into our existing device or a new device? It was, we have this question to answer. We have this amount of clinical data and real world evidence. There's something else that we need to uncover with our patients. I think that would be the discussion, not going and just trying to pitch a patient preference. It's really, how does the patient preference augment what you already have?
I would just say that, yes. I mean, I think, Randy, you specifically mentioned the Q sub submission program, and, you know, I think that's right. And there are different, you know, I think there are ways to engage with FDA early. Christine, I don't know if you have other examples of early engagement with FDA and mechanisms to do so.
So we always encourage the teams that we work with to contact FDA early, recommend sending an email via the email that Femi had as part of his presentation. Mostly the experience we've had has been through Q subs. Sometimes we've had more informal interactions, and of course there's different response times from the FDA depending on the type of program that is being the type of clinical program being pursued. So mostly that's how we've done it, and we've done it, like Todd said, when early on, when the sponsor knows what their research question is, bring forward that research question in the context in which it was developed to discuss with the FDA. And as Femi said, we've done this in the context of presenting the research protocol, so that the details around that research question and how we'll intend to get at it are all there in the document. So it could include the full study design as one of the interactions, and getting feedback both on that design and some of the survey materials and the associated patient-facing documentation.
Thank you. Interesting question. I'll see if I can get it right. My customers' patients are vision impaired and veterinary as well as pediatric. That sounds like a fascinating practice. How relevant is PPI for that subsegment of patients? Let's broaden that a little bit. When is, you know, what are the right patient populations? And maybe also talk a little bit about situations like, the tubes, where the patient is not actually the person whose preference you care about. By the way, as a kid who had 3 tube surgeries, I strongly object to not asking 3-year-old Randy what his opinion was about the tubes. I still remember my recovery from that.
Well, the FDA defines an adult, I think, as 22 and older for devices. So we in terms of measuring preferences, stick with that definition. But when there's a child or someone who might be cognitively impaired, we would approach the FDA about a sampling plan with caregivers or care partners. And can I answer the bit about the visual impairment? So for working with study participants who are visually impaired, it would be really important to develop a study that could be administered to those adults in a way that would minimize or eliminate the visual component. So in that case, it might be important, for example, to have a recording if it's an online administration, or to have interviewer administered like a phone interview rather than an online interview that would require reading, and to keep, because they won't have the visual information to refer back to, perhaps to keep the number of attributes and the information to a minimum to make those trade-offs a little easier for the patient. But it would require developing that and pre-testing it to ensure that it worked well in that population.
Thanks. Anybody else before we go to the next one? Got a nod to your heads no, so I know the answer is no. Okay, so interesting. We have 2 questions where I'll bundle them together. They're not really related, but it's people, I think, probing the edges of PPI, and you say PPI, do you really mean this? So the first one is, will the preference study affect the FDA submission? So we've already talked about a positive case study here with Todd, but then they say, what if it's a bad result? Although it's preference, so I'm not sure what a bad preference is, but that's one question. The other one here is, it's almost like, can you be a little bit pregnant with PPI? Like, what if I do some lightweight PPI and tack it on to the end of formative usability studies? Is there any value in that? So I'll throw this back to you all.
I'll try and take a stab at the first part of that question. Like any research, patient preference is also research. You may set out to get a particular outcome, but like research, you do not know the outcome. That outcome may be quote unquote positive or quote unquote negative with respect to your submission to the FDA. I am suspecting that if most companies probably go and conduct a PPI study, if it's not, doesn't lend itself well to their research question or supportive of what they're trying to do with the FDA, I don't think that's a value add to their submission. But having said that, not, like we said earlier, not you have to think carefully about why you're doing the PPI study to begin with. What is the goal for the PPI study? What are you trying to learn? These studies take time, these studies take resources. So that, if you think carefully and there's a way you design the study and there's a question of interest that fits in nicely with the overall evidence you're trying to submit to the FDA, the value out of PPI is that it may show something positive to, again, product development. What features do patients in these patient populations care about, right? That's something that if you thought of early in your product development stage, may be a value add to inform clinical design. Clinical trial outcomes to measure. You may have device areas where there's no consensus on what information to measure. A PPI study could be powerful in that place, like to build consensus. Performance targets in the clinical trial. Christy mentioned the device for the air tubes. That was a PPI study that informed an area where there was no clear evidence on performance targets for those devices. Right up that idea of thinking carefully of what the PPI study was early on and designing the study and going to get that data, regardless of knowing the outcome, will still be beneficial ultimately, because again, in these particular examples, there are no consensus on that metric.
I would just
Can
like,
I
Go ahead,
Christine,
Cindy.
I'll go ahead and add to Femi, and then Christine, I'll pass it over to you. Just to add to Femi's point about it being research and sort of, you don't know what you're going to get exactly. But framing the question such that you can use the information that you're going to get means, I think, for a lot of folks, trying to push some of this work a little earlier in their development program, because it allows you to then kind of flex and use that information to contextualize whatever it is that you're doing, whether that's designing your trial or making amendments and changes to your device, identifying a particular subset of the population more precisely so that you can target and enroll the right people into your trial. So that kind of use case for that information can be very helpful if you think about designing the question so that you can use the information as opposed to maybe trying to think about what the quote unquote right information or good or bad information you might get. Oh, Christine?
Yeah, sure. So one of the places where I hear people being concerned that the answer might be wrong is when risk tolerance, we might find that there's a portion of the sample that's not very risk tolerant, or there's a portion of the sample that might not be interested in the device. And I think from our experience, that has what we've seen is when there is, there's usually variability within the sample. So you might have a portion of the sample that's uninterested or a portion of the sample that's less risk tolerant. But I think that one of the values of these studies is it can help you understand how much of the sample might not be interested, and more importantly, how much of the sample is interested. And in our experience, FDA has really found that information useful to understand the patient perspective. So I think even thinking carefully about what negative might be, and in that context.
Yeah, one thing we did as a sponsor, we were concerned that there was quite a bit of excitement from our patient advocacy groups and the renal team that we were going to go down this pathway. We did do a pretty extensive pilot to see, are we even in the right space here? Is there a risk tolerance for what we're proposing before we're going to jump in, one, get FDA and the patient advocacy group excited, and two, investing the effort to do the study. So a small pilot proved out two things: that we were sort of directionally in the right place from a risk perspective. And then secondly, as I mentioned before, it really taught us that we had to develop also a much more validatable, better survey for the patients.
All right, if I could ask the panelists, please, there's 3 open questions that I think can be pretty quickly answered, well, hopefully quickly answered. 2 are about the ear tube study, and one is a question about how can you capture the responses to the questions? Actually, a couple. I want to ask 2 more high-level questions, so hopefully we can answer these. By the way, we'll give you contact information if you have follow-ups. I see some people are being really great at sending in a bunch of different interesting questions. So one, how long does it take if I'm here and I'm just starting to consider PPI today? Talk to nobody, learn nothing, not put together a team, not talk to the FDA. How long until I can have valid results in my hands analyzed?
I'll take a pass at that. What we usually expect in terms of the duration of a patient preference study or preference study from the very beginning to the end is at least 1 year. And that depends a lot on a couple things. One, how many times you would like to seek FDA input. It's important to do that and to make time for it in the study timeline. In some cases, the development of the survey instrument might take longer depending on the amount of alignment there is within the research team and the amount of clinical and other types of support data there are to develop that instrument. And it can also take some time to recruit patients depending on the eligibility criteria and whether that is a hard to reach population. So a minimum of a year, but it can take longer.
Presumably that then duration is also tied to cost over time? some extent at least?
It can be. I mean, I think that the things that can add to the cost of this also depend on the number of times you want to do user testing or pre-testing to recruit patients. I mean, some of it is tied to the indication.
Anybody else on that one? No, we're good. Okay. So one final question. And first of all, thank you to all the panelists and thank you for our audience for hanging in with us. We'll do a little editing on the video if there was part that didn't work. I'm actually going to ask the panelists to re-record a couple of the slides. But we hope this has had value for you. Send us your suggestions for future webinars. Also, you will hear from us asking for feedback on this webinar. So you can tell us about the logistics. We're quite aware of that one. But I am at least. But if we'd love to hear your feedback on everything else. So final question, and this is a completely non-scientific hunch question for anybody who wants to tackle it. And this is a pretty powerful tool. What is the market penetration of PPI right now, so to speak? You know, would you say half the studies that could use PPI that you see are using it, or do you think we're really sort of at a fairly early stage, and there's still a lot more potential for a lot more devices out there to make good use of PPI and have better applications?
I can take a stab at this just from the FDA perspective. Cindy earlier presented a timeline slide on PPI at the FDA. So from that perspective, I'll say we've seen most of the PPI studies around that pre-market phase to support pre-market benefit risk decision making. We've seen a decent trend, positive trend in that direction. I still think there's a lot of opportunity to use PPI earlier to inform clinical trial design, performance targets, target product profiles, etc. I also still see a lot of opportunity for PPI to inform the post-market and uncertainty around things of interest in the post-market space. I still think there's opportunity to get more PPI there. Yeah, done in those areas. Yeah.
I would agree with that. And I would also say that there is an opportunity, and I'd be interested in, Christine, your perspective on this. I do think there's also an opportunity for PPI methodologies to evolve. You know, they are expensive and can be time consuming, especially for small companies with limited resources. And so trying to think about what are the ways to maintain and can continue to advance the rigor of these methodologies while making them a bit more accessible. And also, you know, I know in FDA, we use a lot the word fit for purpose. I'll use this in a different context, which is that you want your methodologies to be kind of fit into your development pipeline and the types of questions that you're trying to answer. And I don't necessarily know if we have that level of precision on the methodological side in PPI quite yet.
I was going to reference the draft guidelines, because I think in those draft guidelines, what I'm seeing is a broader list of methods, both qualitative and quantitative, that can be brought to bear on these questions that are going to FDA. Whether they're going to FDA or not, though, I can say that at RTI and other health preference researchers are working on ways to conduct preference studies as efficiently as possible. And one of the things that we've been doing and seeing is some mixed methods approaches, where we're combining some quantitative preference assessment with some qualitative preference assessment, which is really has a lot of strengths in terms of both the richness of the qualitative data to supplement that quantitative data. But I will acknowledge with Femi, Cindy, and Dave here on the phone, we have not submitted any of that to FDA, but the guidance does appear to have an interest in certainly qualitative and quantitative. But yes, Cindy, I think that there's room for advancement in the methods, and I think health preference researchers are working on that.
So it sounds like we should be positively encouraging people not just to brush up on the current state of PPI science, but to be thinking and bringing into conversations or pre-sub discussions of could we extend this and try something different here? Can we have a methodological discussion? So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us and all of our panelists. And please send us your feedback or follow up with questions. I know there's not all the questions got answered here. So Kay will be passing out the information about how to reach all of us. And thank you to Matter for hosting this.
And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.